This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On May the 24th, Richard Fadden, retired Director of the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service and former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada, addressed the Institute.
Well, thanks very much, and good evening, everybody. Just before I start, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me here, not because I particularly like rambling on, but because I truly do believe that in this country we don't talk enough about national security issues, and whenever I have an opportunity, I try and do so. So I very much commend your efforts in that direction. The only time we seem to talk about national security in this country is after a crisis, and I think that's probably the worst time to do something like that. So this evening I thought I would talk a little bit about, it could be called the 21st century national security environment. A difficult world moves to the future, but generally what I want to talk about a little bit is the new threat reality of today and what I think will be the reality of tomorrow. I should also say that I don't expect that everybody in the room will agree with everything that I say, but I hope that both what I say and the question and answer period will give you pause for thought. I mean, that's the real objective. Inconceivable to me that you would agree with everything I say, but I think it's worthwhile if we can have a good dialogue and just generally improve the discussion of these sorts of items. So this evening I want to talk a little bit about the concept of national security and what I think it means, but the bulk of my conversation is about the characteristics of the world today and of tomorrow from a perspective of national security, with a bit of a contrast from the worlds of yesteryear. And then a few specific words about terrorism, cyber, and the shifting balance of power in the world. So I come to this idea of national security, I think, honestly, because as Ed was saying, I've been in CSIS, national defense. I started my career in foreign affairs, and I ended up as the sort of general coordinator of all of this in national security. And the point I wanted to make is that in today's world, just about everything is interconnected. So anybody who believes that they can have a standalone defense policy or a standalone foreign policy or a standalone development policy, I think they're being unrealistic. Every country needs a bit of a chapeau, and whether you call it a national security policy or something else, I think it's something that we really need. You only have to think about our experience in Afghanistan, for example, where it took us a few years to realize that just playing whack-a-mole with the Taliban is not enough. You need to involve politics, development, and economics. Same thing that we're living today in Iraq, and I suspect it's also true in Central Africa, where it is rumored we may be spending some of our troops before too long. Sorry? Okay, well, let's talk about it during the Q&A period. So what I thought I would do to start things off is to put the current environment in a bit of context. Not everybody in this room is as old as I am, so just to situate things. Very, very quickly, World War II, existential threat to our way of life, absolute total engagement of the population. Post-World War II, trying to get our act together, massive change in the operation of the planet. People wanted to forget about security. They wanted to forget about defense. In this country and in the United States, they wanted to have children, not a great deal more. Certainly no existential threat. The Cold War, NATO versus the Soviet Union, mostly concerned with MAD, mutually assured destruction. Again, an existential threat, and it wasn't very difficult to convince the population of the day that this was really important. And I'll come back to this theme because I think one of the problems we have today is convincing our population that there is a threat that we have to deal with. Post-Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall, fall of the USSR, and what we thought, incorrectly as it turns out, I believe, the victory of the West. Russia and China beginning to show their presence on the planet, international instantaneous communications beginning to have an impact on a whole raft of things, some good, some bad. The growth of non-state players for the first time, making a very, very main difference. It felt like, I think, an existential threat. Now, 9/11 felt like an existential threat. I would argue it was not. And that's one of the problems that we continue to have today, that feeling of not being under an existential threat. So post 9/11 today, the West is under threat from ongoing terrorism, and I think the rebalancing of power, which I'll talk about both of these in a few minutes. Politically, the fall of the center, which is, I think, something that is one of the most important things that is occurring today, not just in the United States or Europe, but around the world. Extremists of both left and right are gaining the ascendancy, whereas the center, where compromise is made, is beginning to disappear. Extremism making a real rebirth. Terrorism continues to develop. I think we're seeing the rebirth of spheres of influence. You'll remember that was a concept during the Cold War. And if you think about it a little bit today, the US, Russia, and China are beginning to carve out parts of the world where they think they should have the final say. I think that's going to be a real problem. So just to situate things, and one of the reasons I wanted to go through this is to point out that on a couple of occasions in the lifetime of many people, perhaps not in this room, but many people, we faced existential threats and we got through them. We faced significant changes in the psychology of, sort of running the planet, and we got through them. So despite the fact that a large chunk of my talk today is not going to be particularly uplifting, because I don't think we're going to be in better shape after a little while, we need to put it in perspective. And I think that's something that's lacking today, perspective. The planet is not about to fall to pieces, despite the fact that things like Manchester or Nice or other places are occurring. So let me talk, if I may, a little bit about what I would call the characteristics of our national security environment. First, we're not facing an existential threat. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means that people in particular who are leading democratic states have, if you'll forgive my language, a hell of a time convincing their populations to spend time, money, and effort on national security issues. It's a big problem in this country, in part, I think, because most people do not think we're facing any particular threats. We have 3 oceans in the United States. Why should we worry? I'll come back to that. But fundamentally, there are no longer 2 blocks, just a whole bunch of associated states, but a multiplicity of players, which is something we haven't had to deal with for a long, long time. Another characteristic of the current era is threats are coming from a variety of sources. If you think back about the eras that I talked about a few moments ago, we dealt with states. Today we're talking about states, terrorist groups, criminal groups, general troublemakers, especially in the cyber field. Each of these, and I think it's important to note, require different strategies, different tactics, and different tools to deal with them. And in my experience, governments are not particularly good in developing these separate tactics. We tend to favor a one-size-fits-all. But you can't deal with an international terrorist group the same way as you can deal with a semi-state or an ungoverned space. And it's something I think we need to come to grips with. And we certainly can't use the same tactics in the cyber field, which is becoming, I think, more and more of our challenges. Another characteristic is the motivation behind each threat. They're very numerous, and they reflect a multiplicity of ideological views, far more than was the case during the Cold War. You'll remember that during the Cold War, there were the good guys and the bad guys. There were the communists and the capitalists. It is far more complicated today to try and understand why a whole variety of states and groups are doing what they do. So if we had difficulty, and a lot of the papers that were released using the 30-year rule proved, if we had difficulty understanding the mindset of the Kremlin, and we really did, we misjudged them across the board, and they misjudged us in the West. Think of how difficult it is to try and figure out what in God's name is going through the minds of the leaders of Daesh or of Al-Qaeda or of some of the groups in Asia. This makes dialogue with any of them very difficult, if not almost impossible. Another characteristic which I think is worth talking about a little bit is that most if not all states can act relatively independently. So if you go back again to the Cold War, there were 2 blocks, and most of us did what the bloc leaders told us to do. There's a whole raft of countries that did what the Soviet Union wanted, and there's a whole raft of countries led by the United States who hewed pretty well the same path. There were a bunch of countries around the world who sort of loosely associated with one or the other, but there wasn't a great deal of divergence in terms of policies. Today, most of the countries on the planet can go their own way, and they often do. It significantly complicates, I think, the management of foreign relations and all sorts of other things of that nature. So if you add to this the difficulties of gaining consensus in multilateral organizations, you can understand why it's very hard to get movement. Think of how hard it is to get a consensus in either NATO or the EU. The counter to this, the negative side of this, is that our adversaries can react like this. I don't think Mr. Putin, when he decides to do something in respect of the West, convenes a meeting of 8 or 9 or 32 countries and has a debate over 6 months. It has become a significant problem. The West is not able to act very quickly, whereas most of our adversaries, both state and non-state, can turn around close to on a dime. The fifth characteristic that I wanted to talk about a little bit was we now deal with the immediate communications encompassing the globe. It amplifies the effect of virtually any event, and it complicates responses. And we have a good example in the case of Manchester. The British government is allegedly furious with the United States intelligence community for leaking information relating to the investigation. But having said that, there are probably people in southern India who know as much about what happened in Manchester as we all do. The really downside to this is that people lose their sense of perspective, and they want instantaneous reactions from their governments and sometimes overly harsh reactions. So I come back again to the question of perspective. What happened in Manchester is awful, and if it weren't in the United Kingdom, but in a couple of other countries I could think of, there would be calls for lining up people against the wall and shooting them. So this amplification of reaction, I think, has become something that our political leaders are finding increasingly difficult to deal with. Terrorism. It's certainly not new, and it's certainly something that we've faced in the past, but I think as a substitute or a partial substitute for traditional warfare, it has a new force and a new face. What I mean by that is, how are we going to be clear? This country, which has forces in Iraq, how is it going to be clear to us that we've attained a victory in Iraq and Syria, or at a minimum, that we haven't failed? What is going on in Iraq right now? Is it a counterinsurgency? Is it a civil war? Is it a traditional war? Or is it a counter-terrorism effort? I could find you a whole raft of people in the chanceries of the world and in academe and probably in the media who could argue one or the other. It really makes a difference because the applicable laws that govern how people act in these circumstances are very, very different. We have not done very well, I think, in coming to grips with these. Cyber. Cyber have, I think, changed how we think about threats of all sorts, about terror, about criminality, and even about warfare and espionage. To give you an example, I was chatting with somebody about this in the bar earlier. When the news first came out about the alleged Russian attempts to influence the United States election, I mean, people have been bouncing off walls. Not that I think it's a good thing, because it's not. But I looked up a couple of days later on the internet, I Googled efforts by countries to influence elections in other countries. And you know the country that came up most frequently? It's our friends to the south. So I'm not commenting on that in one way or the other, except to note that the response to the alleged Russian efforts to influence the US election were exaggerated, A, because they used cyber, which we have not done in the past, and B, because of the instantaneous communications thingy I was just talking about. So cyber has fundamentally changed, I think, the way that we think about a whole raft of events that are going on around the world. I did a bit of research for a set of other remarks that I did a couple of months ago. The United Nations estimates that $1 trillion a year is stolen in intellectual property through the use of the internet in one shape, form, or the other. And in this country, if I remember correctly, I think it was 28 or 29 billion. And in the United States, it's a couple hundred billion. So we didn't even think about this because the internet didn't exist. But the internet is now being used for espionage, criminality, terror, and a whole raft of other things. And we have not completed, I think, yet our thinking about how to deal with elements of the cyber threat. The eighth item I wanted to mention was targets are not restricted to states anymore. In the good old days, the target was a state. Think of World War II, think of Korea. It was not very complicated. To state the obvious, now we have states, sub-states, religious groups, ethnic groups, sectors of the economy, and even individuals. Basically, everyone and everything is a target. Manchester again proved this, and I don't think that we in the West have come to grips with the fact that the targets, the potential targets, fundamentally change or should fundamentally change the way that we think about the world that we're living in. The ninth factor I wanted to talk about was, I think the same can be said for the tools used to perpetuate terror or criminality. To the traditional weapons of war, you add IEDs, suicide, and cyber weapons. These additional tools, I think also it's important to remember, inflict physical harm, and I'll come back to this, but I think in the end, if the West wanted to win the physical part of terror, if we wanted to win in Iran, or Iraq rather, it's possible. But all we're going to do is move them. I mean, the combined resources of the West is so significant, there's no way that anybody can resist. But I think we are fundamentally failing in what I call the psychological component of the war. The use of the internet by our adversaries is something we haven't even begun to deal with. You can go on your computer when you leave here tonight, you can find, without a great deal of effort, advice on how to build a bomb, on how to join Daesh, on how to recruit people in your neighborhood to do terrorist acts. Some of the most outrageous philosophies that you can find, and there is not a country in the West who has yet come to grips with this, in part because of our preoccupation with civil rights and the liberties that are enshrined in our constitutions. But I think there is a general view that we're losing this battle, and we need to do something to deal with it. So to the extent that this sort of psychological shift represents a fundamentally different way of dealing with threats, I think we need to remember my argument about perspective. For those, nobody in this room was around in World War I, but think of what the officers and men of the day went into that war thought when they were coming out of it, with tanks, aircraft, and gas. Utterly changed the nature of war. They got on with it, they managed to change doctrine, and we've now moved on. We're going to have to find a way to do the same thing with these non-traditional weapons. 10, borders are not what they used to be, to state the absolute obvious. In both the positive, I think, and the negative sense, in many ways they don't exist, which makes fighting terror and cyber attacks much more difficult, except that for them there are no borders. I can remember when I was the director of CSIS talking to some of my colleagues from Europe. It was one of the most depressing exercises I've ever engaged in, because once you entered the EU, they utterly and completely lost you, unless you did something that attracted the attention of the police. And I think one of the downsides of what's happened over the course of the last couple of years from a political perspective is that Schengen is falling apart. Borders are now being reestablished throughout Europe, which I thought was one of the most significant developments in relations between states since World War II. At the same time, going back to my point about reconstituting borders, we're doing so in a fairly mechanical way. We need only think about Mr. Trump's view that a wall is going to solve all his problems on the southern border. In fact, there is, to a great extent, a wall there already. It's just not complete over the course of the entire length of the border. But we're reverting to a view of borders as a mechanical place to stop things and people, when one of the overarching objectives of all of the governments that we think about is to encourage trade and the movement of people. So there's beginning to be a real conflict that we have not seen for a long time. The 11th characteristic that I wanted to talk about was that internal and external threats are merging. In the good old days, the enemy was outside of one's country. I mean, think back to the Cold War. You know, sure, there were a few Russian spies mucking about, and they could potentially cause a great deal of trouble, but all of our enemies were outside of the country. Today, we have potential freedom fighters, we have people being radicalized to violence within the country. The same applies to the United States and to most of the states of Europe. We have to recognize this is the case, but the biggest difficulty I think we're having is that we need different tools. You must use different tools to deal with internal and external threats. most countries have very, very different rules which apply to external activities and internal activities. When does the constitution of a country stop and begin? I remember when I was in defense, we had a really big argument about the extent to which some non-military actors from the government of Canada were either governed by the laws of war, by the Charter of Rights, or by something else. And I don't think that's been entirely resolved yet. We need to figure out whether the same rules applied, and if they don't, what we're going to do to make sure that they remain effective. My one attempt at a soundbite is that national security is not national. And I think that's self-evident if you think about it. In the good old days, you had national level security agencies dealing with national security. Today, I think that is absolutely inconceivable. No one country can deal with the security threats that I'm talking about. You need international collaboration. And I think no one country, or certainly nation state, can deal with these sorts of internal problems that I'm talking about without the help of their provinces and states, their municipalities, civil society, and a whole bunch of other things. Again, it's a lesson that I do not think that we've really learned in Canada yet. I'll come back to this later, but I would argue that we're far better to develop our capacity to stop violent extremism before it occurs, as opposed to arresting somebody after they've blown up something. And we're not very good at this. And the federal government of Canada, of which I was a part for 40-odd years, is particularly ill-suited for this, I would argue, because the federal government is the government that is the furthest from the population. We need to engage the provinces, municipalities, school boards, civil society. We're beginning to do that in this country, and some provinces are doing it better than others. But there's a spectrum here that we haven't quite figured out on who should deal with what at a particular point in time. And I think if we don't do it better, we're in for a great deal of trouble. Yet even in a state like the United Kingdom, which is unitary, they have difficulties. They only have the federal government or the national government there to deal with national security, and it's difficult to engage all levels of their society. My last point was, it's unclear in what category of G world we're living in, which is my way of saying, are we living in a G1 world, a G7 world, a G20 world? I think it's really important because to a considerable degree, the answer to that question determines how much stability we're going to have on our planet. I would argue, and here I'm not going to get into a long debate about Mr. Trump, but I would argue that the role of the United States has become increasingly uncertain over the course of the last little while, and that alone may not shift from a G1 to a G5 or whatever, but the ascendancy of China and the resurgence of Russia is significantly altered, has significantly altered the power balance around the planet. And the practical effect of this is that there are a raft of countries who don't really know where to look. I don't mean this in a negative way. Many of you probably have, as I did, Australian colleagues. And they spent close to a decade sorting out how they're going to deal with China and the United States. They've sort of found a way of dealing with it. All things economic, they think China, and all things strategic, they think the United States. But it's an imperfect solution. And I think Australia is able to do it because it's a very sophisticated and stable society. But think of all the smaller countries in that part of the world, the Malaysias, the Indonesias, and whatnot. They are faced with increasing pressure, kinetic pressure in some cases, from China, and yet their instincts often drive them towards the United States, which is, in many instances, not as enthusiastic as it used to be in terms of protecting its position in that part of the world. The bottom line here, it seems to me, is that all of this comes together in a stew and makes for a very unstable world. So that means that potential conflicts between states are more possible than they used to be. But more to the point, thinking about terrorism, nothing promotes terrorism more than instability. Practical example, I think the West estimates there are 8 or 9 countries that are basically ungoverned spaces today. When the pressure in Syria got too heavy for Daesh, a large chunk of their leadership moved to to Libya, which is now beginning to cause problems by sending operatives into Europe. There are 4 or 5 other ungoverned spaces on the planet, and in every single one of them, terrorist groups are beginning to take root. Mr. Fries, don't say what I'm going to say next, because I'm being facetious. But I sometimes think that we should invoke the trusteeship provisions of the UN Charter, because in some of these cases, there's no other solution. There's nobody locally who can deal with these ungoverned spaces. Back on the record. I say this mostly because if anybody heard me say this, they'd think I'd lost my mind, because the trusteeship provisions have a very, very bad reputation in the third world. But somehow, we are going to have to come to grips with these ungoverned spaces, both for strategic reasons and because in most of them, tens and tens of thousands of people are dying from hunger or by being killed in local battles of one sort or the other. So I just come back to the point that the kind of G-world that we live in becomes very important. And my sense is we're not going to sort this out for the next little while, except maybe we're going back to spheres of influence. I think that's already pretty obvious in the case of Russia. I don't know if any of you know people from the Baltic countries or the Nordic countries, but I don't think I'm putting too fine a point on it when I say that many of them are downright old-fashioned scared about what the Russians are going to do. In this particular case, NATO has done something about it, but Russia has not hesitated in a whole raft of ways from exercising pressure. It's not helpful. It's very, very destabilizing. To give you an example, again from my past, you'll remember that during the Soviet period, they had a habit of sending long-range bombers up and down the east and west coasts of North America, and they used to go down as Venezuela. This stopped for quite a number of years, and they started up again, along with spending hundreds of millions of rubles resurrecting the Arctic bases of the Soviet Union. But they've also started doing this in Europe. And a colleague of mine told me that they've now stopped doing this, but at one point, just to irritate, the Western European airspace guardians, they'd get very close to the United Kingdom and they'd turn off their transponders. Now, if you think about that part of the world, it's one of the busiest parts of the world from an air perspective. They'd turn off their transponders, drive everybody absolutely mad, and turn them back on again when they got near Portugal. They were only doing this to cause trouble. And I give this as a relatively straightforward example of the dozens and dozens of things that I'm not going to talk about that Russia is doing on a regular basis to advance their view of the universe. I think it's fair to say that fundamentally Russia and China are revisionist states, and by that I mean they are fundamentally unhappy with the way the world is organized right now. They really are. They do not like it. They see a certain weakness in the United States and in NATO and in Europe, and they are going not all out, but they're going to a considerable distance to try and push change, the Ukraine and Crimea being the most extraordinary examples. And they may get away with it. How often do we talk about Crimea now? It's basically accepted that it's part of Russia and it's going to stay that way. Several states in Europe want to remove the sanctions, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are a variety of people in Mr. Trump's administration who want to do the same thing. So the first bald taking over of another state's territory since World War II, I think, is going to go unpunished. And if Mr. Putin can do this with Crimea, I believe he thinks he can do it in other parts of the world, particularly in the old part of the world that the Soviet Union used to rule. I think one of the other characteristics of this part of the world, or this time frame, is that, and I go back to the point about it's very hard to decide what we're fighting and whether we're going to win or not. But the key element here that I want to stress is that nothing is short term. If you're organized on the basis of elections every 4 or 5 years, and you're a politician, you're a political leader in any of the Western states that we work with, and you're told by your military and civilian officials that, yes, we can do something in country X, but it's going to take 20 years for something to be effectively accomplished. Getting attention from those political leaders and the investment in time, money, and effort is a real uphill battle. Yet, many argue that if we in the West generally had stayed in Afghanistan another 10 years, particularly with the new focus that we brought to bear near the very end, we might have had far more of an influence than I think we have had in practice. So today, the estimate is that about a third of the country is no longer under control of Kabul. So you've got the Taliban, Daesh, the Haqqani networks, and the warlords fighting again for control of Afghanistan. And I think the United States military has just asked the U.S. president for permission to bring in more troops. I think they're asking for 3,000. It's not even beginning to be enough. So all of the efforts that the West put into Afghanistan may come to naught. They're certainly better off from a variety of perspectives. Their medical systems are better. They have more schools and whatnot. But in terms of strategically rebalancing the country, we left too soon. I just use this as an example. What are we going to do with Iraq and Syria? I don't think there's an answer to that, but we sure as heck can't leave for another 10 or 15 years or Iraq will fall to pieces. I was there a couple of years ago, and I came away thinking it's barely a state. I mean, Baghdad was under control of the central government, and there were points here and there that were. So one solution is to break up the country, make it a federal state of some sort. They have the Kurdish problem in the north, and they have chunks of Syria. It doesn't really matter what you think what is going to happen in Iraq or Syria, but how long can a democracy, and I include Canada in this, how long can a democracy sustain a military and development set of programs in a country like that without the population saying, we have demands on the tax dollars in this country? Again, I'm not condemning any one government in any country. I'm just arguing we have a problem now with this sort of thing that we did not have 20, 25 years ago. We haven't found a way to deal with it. One last sort of preliminary conclusion, which is, I'm coming back to it because I think it's really important. The values which most of us in the West have enshrined in our Constitution. We face people who have no such restraints whatsoever. So when the Daesh, beheaded those 30 or 40 people in Syria a few months ago, what do? We get very upset and we treat them as subhuman, but what do? Syria is still in theory under international law a sovereign state. I mean, bombing them out of existence might have been what some people wanted to do, but with the Russian involvement, that's now impossible. So the rules that we apply to ourselves fundamentally do not apply to our adversaries at all. And I think it's another complicating factor in our stew. So, just to be upfront, I'm well aware that I'm not painting a particularly bright future, and you can easily disagree with one or other of the points that I'm making. But it seems to me that for a variety of perspective, the planet right now is nowhere near as stable as it was even 10 or 15 years ago. And for a variety of reasons, we have not significantly moved the file towards finding a solution. To be direct, I think the Obama administration in the United States has complicated resolution of a lot of these issues because Mr. Obama's view of the restrained use of force by the United States left a lot of country believing that the United States would never do anything. And I've actually been told this by people that when the United States failed to respond to the Syrians crossing the red line, they became convinced the United States was not going to act. And I would remind us, just, to make you feel worse than I probably have already, over 400,000 people have been killed in Syria. And how often do we hear about this in the newspapers today, Mr. Fries? You'll get even with me. But my point is, the media, governments, academe, everybody is moving on because we've become inured to the scope of the problem. 400,000 people in a country not a heck of a lot larger than our maritime provinces. and we don't talk about it anymore. And that's just one example. Having said all of this, just, the world is not falling to pieces. Poverty is significantly down throughout the planet. Since the 1950s, there have been no wars between major powers. Life expectancy is up. The condition of women is improving. I could go on with a long list, but I don't think it alters the sort of strategic picture that I'm trying to paint. So what I'm hoping that my remarks will do is just cause us to think a little bit about what we're going to do about some of these problems. I mean, my colleagues, when I was in government, were trying to find solutions, as is the case with most Western governments. But to a considerable degree, because of who we are, these problems are almost intractable, both in terms of time frames, the values that are applied to the kind of reactions we want to have, and everybody on the other side of the argument knows about this. So let me talk just for a couple of minutes about terrorism, radicalism, and one other topic. I think that the level of terrorism in the planet today reflects what, some of you probably Star Wars fact, a significant imbalance in the time-space continuum. I mean, it isn't just that, there are a few terrorist groups who don't like us. We feel under attack, but the Muslim world feels under attack. Let me ask you, what was the last country the West invaded that was not either Muslim or a majority Muslim population? I had some research done at one point. Grenada. So you can understand why the Muslim world feels under attack. And I don't know what we're going to do about it, except at some point we're going to have to find a way with Muslim countries to talk about this. They fundamentally believe, ils ont la conviction intime, as the French say, that they are under attack by the West. Not all of them. I mean, one should never generalize. But enough of them that the terrorism problem is not going to go away. And the activities that we have to deal with range from, lone wolf killings to a couple people, to the ISIS attacks in Paris, to Manchester, to Syria, and the ungoverned spaces that I talked about. We have to find some way of dealing with this over the course of the next little while. So I come back to my basic theme that the West cannot expect to deal with these terrorist threats through the use of kinetic force alone. We have to find some way, somehow, to talk to these people, or to isolate them, or something. The problem, of course, is in my use of the word "these people," I'm creating a problem, because it's hard to identify who these people are. Most governments in the West consider that the vast majority of Muslims on the planet are as peace-loving as we are, but our adversaries are interspaced with them, and we don't know where to find them and with whom to speak. Somebody was asked at a conference a while ago, how can you explain the fanaticism of some of Daesh's senior leadership? They really are very, very fanatical. And the example that was given was, it was like the last days of the Third Reich. The people who were still fighting for Hitler at that stage, this individual thought, same level of fanaticism that you find in Daesh. These are the people who are beheading people, burning people alive, etc., etc. How do you talk to these people? I'm not sure. I don't even know if it's possible. But I suggest to you that simply using kinetic force, while necessary in some cases, ain't enough to solve the problem. Domestic radicalism or domestic radicalization, I'm almost finished. It's a problem virtually everywhere. And it's not only a problem with Daesh and Al-Qaeda, there are also some right-wing radicals, violent radicals. In democratic states, it's very difficult to notice before radicalization becomes violent radicalization. How many of you have kids or grandkids in schools whose kids probably know somebody who's inclined to radicalism? I'd say virtually everybody. Probably everybody in this room at one point wanted to do something radical when we were young. It's the movement from radical to violent radicalism we're not very good at catching, and in particular, police and intelligence organizations are not suited to do. We need to find another way of doing this. We have to involve school boards, civil society, and a variety of other groups. I would argue that countering violent extremism, which is governmentese for dealing with this kind of problem, is one of the things that we need to spend much, much more attention on, as opposed to the variety of other issues on the terrorism front. We have approximately, I think, 150 returning freedom fighters in Canada, people who've left and who've gone to fight in Afghanistan or Somalia, Sudan, or Syria and Iraq. Some of these people will never lift a gun again. They are so disgusted by what they saw, they'll never touch anything like this again. Others, they'll help out the cause if they have an opportunity, and a few have been sent back with a clear intent of either creating acts of terrorism or being recruiters. CSIS and the RCMP have limited capacity. And which ones do you follow? How do you know who's a danger? And we have no problem compared to the French, who have something of the order of plus 2,000 returning peoples from Syria and Iraq in particular, which allows me to just open a parenthesis. A lot of people wonder, if because of Manchester something's going to happen in this country. I don't know more than anybody else, but the problem in Europe is fundamentally different than the problem in Canada. I'm not suggesting that we're not under some level of threat, because I firmly believe that we are. The last time I checked, there were 21 people in federal penitentiaries in Canada having been convicted of terrorism attempts. It's not an insignificant number for a country of our size. But in Europe, where there are untold thousands of people who've returned from Syria and Iraq and other places, the level of threat that they face is significantly higher. At the time I retired as NSA, and subsequently, both the French and the British security services have been convinced they're going to face additional attacks, and in both cases they've proved to be entirely correct. And the general view is, not just because of what Prime Minister May says, but the general view is they're going to face more, and a lot more before they're finished. So somehow, in dealing with this on a spectrum, I view radicalization on a spectrum. Very violent on one side, you need to involve the police and the security services. At the very other end, you need to involve religious groups, sports groups, imams, civil society, to try and figure out who is susceptible of becoming violent and finding a way of dealing with them. And it's not easy to do, because we want to be able to do this, I think, without creating a Stasi-like society where people are snitching on everybody else. But there have been a number of excellent examples in this country where parents or relatives have reported to either CSIS of the RCMP that their children, their nieces, or their nephews were on their way to Syria, and they were stopped before they went. Now, I can't imagine what relations are like in those families, but far better that than going to Syria and becoming a bride to a jihadist or spending your time shooting other people. So CVE, I think, very, very important. So let me come to an end by just saying that, to my mind, despite all of the negative things that I've said, one of the most important things we must do is to keep this in perspective. It's not a cheery list of things that I've set out to you. And again, if even you agree with me to the tune of 50%, it's still not a cheery list of events or circumstances. But it's not as bad as World War II. It's not as bad as the Cold War. I looked up a statistic a while ago, so I'm not sure it's still true, but there are more people who die from accidents in their bathtubs in North America, than die annually from terrorist attacks. Now, I don't know what to do with that statistics except to tell people, remember to put things in perspective, which we don't always do. And there's a whole list of things in the internet about, even the worst year for North America during 9/11, the number of deaths that occurred through a variety of other circumstances far exceeds those that occurred because of terrorism. Having said that, terrorism occurs because it terrorizes people, and we all understand that. So I come back fundamentally to the view that even if some of this is not true, and I suspect some of it is not, as a society, we're going to fail to deal with these if A, we don't keep it in perspective, and if B, we don't talk through some of these issues. Parliament is shortly to be asked to consider whether the powers that Parliament gave CSIS, for example, and a couple of other departments under C-51, whether they're going to be retrenched or not. I don't think they should, and I've already said so publicly, in part because they have neither been overused nor abused. So why withdraw them if people are able to demonstrate that they're helpful? But that's another issue and for our political masters to resolve. But one of the main arguments being utilized to change these powers is that the consultations which occurred about them have suggested that they're excessive and they need to be either eliminated or reduced. Now, how many of you in these rooms participated in those consultations? I would wager not very many, if any. Yet the people who were fundamentally opposed to C-51 in the first place, I think would have been more inclined to go to the C-51 consultations. It's a free country, there's nothing wrong with that, but it does tend, I think, to skew things a little bit. So, I've gone on for too long. I've just tried to give you a bit of a sense of how I, and I think some of the people that I worked with over the years, view the world. And I think it's important to think about these characteristics because when something bad happens, it's not just the specific event, it's the context in which we view that event. Some of the things that I've talked about. It determines how serious we view it, it determines what we're going to do or not do about it. And I thank you again for the opportunity to bore you with my views. Happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Well done. That was really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Bruce?
Could you ask them to identify themselves?
Yeah.
Yes, if you'd identify yourself first, just so I know who's talking.
My name is Bruce Murray. Just to
Okay.
I'll make 3 comments about the world, and you can respond to them. Number 1, Russia. Russia, with the price of oil down where it is bankrupt, and you've got a leader who is using nationalism to cover up the fact he can't deliver to the people. That only lasts so long, and it'll collapse. China, you have 8 grandparents, 4 parents to 1 child, and no country with that demographic can go to war because you can't have heavy casualties among the 1 child that left, and your political support collapsed very rapidly. And third, the Middle East, why do we continue to support the structure that was put in place post-World War I, where Britain and France carved it up and put different minorities within each top city so they could rule it? Why don't we make a Sunni country and a Shia country, and a Christian country, and a Yashidi country, and just let them, I think it would be a lot better than that. And then the mistakes made in George Bush II's invasion of Iraq was, I'll support you, but Saddam was a bad guy, but getting rid of the Ba'athist Party was a horrible mistake because I just happened to know my son's best friend, his mother ran a power plant in Basra, and she had to join the Ba'athist Party or she was going to lose her job, and she actually left the country. But it was just people, the educated people were forced into the Ba'athist Party. Another thing is back to Russia. All the educated people in Russia are leaving. I mean, Russia's no longer like it was pre-1990. You can actually leave the country, and all the educated people have left, so you're left with a large number of uneducated people, lower educated people, and so their ability to accomplish things nasty or good is probably lower.
No, that's good. Thank you. I think those are very good comments. I'll just comment on your comments very briefly. I think in respect of your last one concerning the Middle East, it's too late. They've developed too much of a national identity in the various countries, and they'll never agree to a redoing of their borders. I think you're dead right. The West, Britain in particular, and the French created the problem that we're having today. But I think the prospect of re-bordering the Middle East, very, very low. They've become too nationalistic. On Russia, I think you're right. But the capacity of the Russians to put up with grief is not insignificant. And despite what you say, and I agree with you, they are still spending hundreds of millions of rubles on their military forces. And I'm not a military expert, but people I know in the Canadian forces, the US forces, and the British forces tell me they are significantly modernizing the Russian armed forces and perhaps being able to make more trouble than we might think, despite the economic situation, which I agree with you is appalling.
Excellent. Are there any more questions? Yes. Could you identify yourself then?
Sure. Good evening, Alan Burton. You spoke a lot about threats to the country, primarily armed. Could you just touch a little bit on where the money's going? So we talk about Russia having economic problems and China going around investing all over the country, and here as well as Asia and Africa. So what is, can you just comment on the threat of that? So we have, in the paper recently.
Sorry, you have to speak up into.
Sorry, recently there's been comment about the Chinese investing into Bombardier as well as other key industries in Canada, and they're doing the same thing in really in Asia and Africa.
Well, I think the bottom line there is the Chinese have, in truth, more money than they really know what to do with right now. They have made their, quote, investments, unquote, much, much more sophisticated today than they were even 10 or 15 years ago. And they're becoming accepted increasingly by third world countries as effective development partners, which was certainly not the case 15 years ago, where they sort of basically took over parts of countries in order to do what they wanted to do. But they have so much money to spend, not just in the third world, but in this country, that I think we're faced with a fundamental issue. Is this fundamentally a bad thing, a neutral thing, or a good thing? And in my experience, I don't think the answer is clear yet. There are some people in the national security communities of the West who think that there is not a single state-owned enterprise of China who operates in the West without a nefarious intent. I'm not sure that's true. On the other hand, there are clearly state-owned enterprises of the Chinese state who operate following dictates of China with nefarious intent. The problem is, how the hell do you distinguish one from the other? This government and Mr. Harper's government, I think both are having difficulties coming up with the China policy, partially for the reason that I've just talked about. We cannot decide if economic and trade relations are sufficiently important to override our security concerns. And I don't think we're the only country that are going through that. So to a considerable degree, China in particular, but also some states in the Middle East are not helping through their use of the money they have. Somebody wrote at one point, for example, that not the state of Saudi Arabia, but rich people, billionaires from within Saudi Arabia, were funding most of the madrasas in Pakistan, and they were teaching some of the most fundamentalist, unwelcome messages on the planet. So if your point was money is important, I agree fundamentally, but I don't know what you do about it. I mean, if the Chinese are prepared to make investments and people can make a butt, they're going to let them do it to a great extent, although in this country we do have some controls. But in other parts of the world where people basically have no money at all, these are very, very welcomed investments. And I don't think we're spending anywhere near as much time on money. You're dead right there.
Yeah, Eric.
Eric Morse, just an ordinary member who will henceforth be very careful not to step in the bathtub. The internet. The first time I heard someone speak in this institute about cybersecurity, he pointed out that when he went to the Soviet Union in 1991 to see what they could do about dismantling the Soviet war apparatus, the scientific defense community, they considered giving them the internet, only to find out that they already had the internet and were using it for criminal purposes. So to a large extent, that being 91, the criminal internet preceded what we know as the internet. question I want to address you, because you're a general security expert and not a cybersecurity expert, is can the internet, as we know it, last much longer before it becomes entirely securitized?
That's a difficult one.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I guess I just will throw a couple facts out. One, slowly but surely, China is constructing its own internet, which is totally separate from the general purpose internet of the planet. And that's several 100 million people who are offline. There are a number of other countries on the planet who control the internet to the extent that they deny their populations entirely access to the internet. One set of facts. Another fact is, I think the internet now has a life of its own. I mean, the United States recently ceded the last bit of control that it had over the internet, and it basically operates on a consensus basis. One of the things that Canada has been doing over the course of the last several years with a number of Western countries is fight a real conscious, strongly orchestrated battle with a number of countries who want to convert the internet to state control entities. Most of the countries that we think about as being our adversaries are absolutely in favor of the internet to the extent that they can absolutely control it. So in large parts of the world, the internet is either entirely state control or is controlled by criminals. And in other parts of the world, and I'd include Canada, I think, while it's certainly not controlled by criminals or by terrorists, it's being misused to a considerable degree. But I do not see how in our current political environment in the West that we can do anything about it, because it will be viewed as trampling on civil liberties, and not unreasonably. So I don't have an answer, except to say that I think we're losing the battle of the internet. We, the West, are losing the battle of the internet, and it's another example of how I think the bad guys, if I can use a childish expression, are fleeter of foot than our governments in terms of dealing with a lot of these issues.
Alex, you had a point there?
Sir, my question is, how do we...
Alex Shadrukas.
Alex, yes, thank you. I mean, you sort of touched on it just now, but how do we ensure protection of our charter rights in this country, our human rights, and maintain the fight that clearly we have to do? And do you think we're doing a good job at maintaining our human rights in light of the threat?
Well, you might be surprised to hear from a national security wonk that I'm not convinced we've got the balance entirely right.
How is it unbalanced?
Well,
What side?
yeah, no, I think it goes back to one of the points I made at the very beginning. Most of the changes that we effect to our legislation and to our funding occurs after crises. And I go back as far as 9/11. Just to remind you, within 3 months of 9/11, Canada voted $7.1 billion on security issues. That would be the equivalent of the United States voting, $70 billion. In retrospect, and I was quite involved in coming up with that total, I would argue that we were a little bit too anxious to disperse it because we were so concerned about what was going on. So that's a small example of how I think perspective and taking our time is important. The Anti-Terrorism Act that was passed at the same time has survived every Supreme Court challenge except one major one. So I guess you'd argue if you put your trust in the courts, we're not doing too badly. I do think, though, that we're failing in establishing the balance because we refuse to talk about why these powers are necessary or are being used. And I think, I have a good friend who works at the University of Ottawa who is absolutely convinced that most of what is in C-51 is a significant mistake. And it may be, but my answer was, Reed and I had the same job a while ago, and the one thing that kept me awake at nights was the fear that something really bad would happen and that I would, the next day or the next week, have to go to the PM or a minister and say, we could have stopped this, but the information that would have allowed that to happen was being held by another department. and they weren't authorized under law to transfer the information. So that's true. I'm not making this up. It really was worrisome. On the other hand, a lot of people believe that if you take all of the information held as an example by the federal government, you're creating a situation that's as bad as 1984, which nobody, including the security services, want. So I think it depends on the particular civil liberty and the particular power that's granted to the security services for us to decide whether there's an abuse or not. I think we've got it fairly close, and the reason I said you might be surprised by what I say is because a lot of people in the security area, broadly defined, think that in Canada we spend too much time worrying about civil liberties and not enough about the threats. And I think part of the reason for this is that people don't feel threatened. But because they don't feel threatened doesn't mean they are threatened. So I come back again to one of my fundamental themes. We don't talk about these things enough in this country. So you get, the occasional person after a major crisis demanding or asking for additional powers, and people on the other side of the argument saying that all of them are outrageous. And I don't know how you get around this. So it's an extraordinarily imperfect answer to your question, except to say that in my little brain anyway, I don't know. I think we've done not badly, but we really need to be careful, which is one of the reasons why I think reviewing all these additional powers, wherever they may be in the government of Canada, every 5 years is something that we should do, and not just wait after a crisis to do things. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer, but it's, yeah.
Yes. Peter McLaurin, Canadian Army. Thanks for your comments tonight. I'd like you to help at least me think a bit more about the new title for Monsieur Daniel Jean, becoming the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. And I think also reflecting upon David Vigneault's new job. And is this a sign? Does this have meaning, or is it just a title? Thank you.
I've asked a few people who are still working, and they've discerned no noticeable shift in powers, responsibilities. Governments, not just Mr. Trudeau's governments generally like changing titles and things like that. They've changed the, when Mr. Trudeau's government came in, he changed the title of significant number of departments. Fundamentally, I haven't found anybody who's been able to suggest to me why the change was made. Maybe they were keeping it secret from me, I don't know. But he's still in the same office, he has the same people working for him, he reports to the same person. So the truth of the matter is, I don't know, because nobody in authority told me, but every rumor that I heard suggests that it was a bit of smoke and mirrors. The one reason that I heard that may or may not be true was that some people in the government didn't like us using the same title as our close allies. Like there's an NSA in the US, there's an NSA in the UK. I don't know if it's true or not, but I've seen no discernible substantive change.
Dan? Yeah.
Dan, you introduced earlier.
Thank you for your uplifting comments.
It's to encourage purchases at the bar afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to help the bottom line, and Mike is very interested in that. Somewhat more pointed question. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Louder.
A somewhat more pointed question. You mentioned Afghanistan and the current state of affairs in Afghanistan, and the degree to which the Taliban, ISIS, and other organizations have taken over significant swaths of the country. The United States, as you mentioned, is thinking about adding troops back into Afghanistan. There is a good possibility, if not a probability, that Canada will also be asked to put troops on the ground again. If you were the NSA today, would you recommend to the government to do that or not?
Yeah, that's quite the question. I think I would start by doing and asking for a review of where on the planet our national interests would require us to dispatch troops. There are some people, for example, who think that we should keep them in the Ukraine for quite a lot longer. Other people believe that a battalion in Estonia is not enough. There are a lot of people who believe we should dispatch people to Africa in peacekeeping. So I would line all these up and recognizing that the military has a relatively limited capacity to do these sorts of things. I would try and suggest to the Prime Minister an analysis of each of these cases. Where is the national interest most directly affected? Which would be my job. His job would take into account a whole raft of other things. But I would say that in respect of, I don't remember the gentleman who said he didn't agree with peacekeeping in Africa. I tend to agree with you on that one. I don't think it's not in the national interest, because anything that encourages stability is a good thing. But I think it's fairly low on the list. I think Estonia, or whatever we're doing in the Nordic countries, would come above Afghanistan, and I would say so. I think the West has to decide, are we going to do something about the Ukraine or not? And if not, then we should ask ourselves if our best contribution is through this provision of military staff or through some other capacity of the federal government. Going to Afghanistan, I would try and develop a pro and con set of arguments, one of which would be, going back to an earlier point I made, if we go back in again, and I've heard the same thing, we and others are going to be asked, are we prepared to stay in for 15 years? Because I think it's going to take that long to have a substantive positive effect. I think the answer to that by virtually any Prime Minister would be, I refuse to give you a commitment of that nature. So, recognizing that I don't have all the facts because I don't work anymore in the government, I would probably recommend against it. But I would set it out in such a way that, to the extent I could do it rationally, all of the potential uses of the military would be set out with the pros and cons of each. But I think on a personal basis, I don't think I would. We're still contributing, I think it's $250 million over a few years. Maybe the thing to do would be to increase the amount of money we give them or change our development assistance. But I don't know. What would you do?
I would go back.
I don't think I would either.
This has been another in the series of podcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find notices of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening.